So to kind of help us set the context a bit before we really get into the meat of the discussion, we've created a global pay equity and pay transparency heat map here that you can see. And orange indicates jurisdictions with more stringent pay equity laws or pay transparency laws or pay reporting requirements. Blue indicates jurisdictions with moderately robust laws or reporting requirements. And then lastly, black indicates jurisdictions with minimal or emerging laws or reporting requirements. And as you can see, countries such as Canada, Brazil, Europe, South Africa, Australia, and Japan stand out as jurisdictions with more stringent laws and reporting requirements. And you'll see that the US has more moderate laws and reporting requirements, although, as we'll see as we move to the next slide, we'll see that it varies considerably by state. So this is a similar heat map where we're just looking at the United States. And so kind of with this just as the backdrop, I think we're ready to kind of get into our discussion about the new Trump presidency and what that means for pay equity and pay transparency reporting. So for our first topic, we're going to talk first about policy and regulation. And my first question is for Maxfield. So Maxfield, how might the Trump administration approach pay equity and pay transparency compared to the prior administration?
So if we kind of look back to the first Trump term, if you will, there were really only, I would say, modest differences between Trump's initial term and then Biden's term regarding the emphasis from a legislation overall policy perspective, right? The current White House does release, on Equal Pay Day, annual reports and emphasizes it. But as far as pushing particular pieces of legislation and or, executive orders really meant to address pay equity generally, I only see modest differences. I think one of the big areas where we will likely see that difference, Trump, in his initial term, pushed back on EEOC component to data collection. And obviously the Biden administration's EEOC has talked about doing that again, right? Even though it really hasn't happened at this point in time. So that's a potential area of difference from an overall policy perspective. But I don't know, Andrew, do you think we're going to see any particular massive changes from an overall legislative agenda at the federal level?
Yeah, I think over the last few years, the shift really has gone to the states. And I think there has been less of a focus on trying to achieve pay equity at a federal level. So I tend to agree that the immediate impact, at least in terms of federal initiatives, is not likely to be huge. There are some areas where the federal government does have a greater impact in pay equity and transparency. Certainly, anyone that is engaging in government contracting with the federal government, it's likely that we'll see some reduced requirements there. We could talk more about that, but so things that are within the federal contracting range, I certainly expect to see some changes. One of the issues that came up years ago was the idea of federally mandated data collection around pay and working hours and that sort of thing. I certainly think that with the new Trump administration, we will not likely see whether it's the EOC or DOL trying to reinvigorate those sort of data collection efforts.
So continuing, with you, Andrew, are there specific policy rollbacks or any deregulatory efforts relating to pay equity and pay transparency that you think employers should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, and that is an area where I do think employers should be vigilant and where they're likely to see some significant areas of concern in terms of what employers might currently be doing. So the new administration has made clear that programs that are not, so the new administration has made clear that they're not happy with, I think, sort of, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way at all, but what they generally regard as DEI. And so to the extent things are rooted strictly in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, as opposed to being rooted in a more legal compliance focus, and I'll talk a little bit about that, I do think there's some risk. I think there's some risk, the so-called sort of reverse discrimination claims. We've certainly been seeing more of those even in the last year. Judicial appointments also could have a significant impact on what employers are doing. So I think from the employer perspective, what's going to be really important in the new administration, and it's something I know a lot of companies have really been focusing on in the last year, is making sure that your existing DE&I efforts, and to the extent your pay equity and transparency program is part of that, that they're rooted in sort of a compliance focus. In other words, making sure that when you do review pay equity, it's for purposes of ensuring that people have equal access to opportunities, that they're being paid the same for the same work. All of that's good. And I think the good thing about pay equity is generally it's deeply rooted in math and objective numbers, and that's great. And so the discipline that comes with that is, I think, perfect, and I think likely to work well in the new administration, because the entire concept is, sort of a data-driven approach to making sure people are rewarded appropriately for the work they're doing. Where it gets potentially riskier, though, is if employers are making decisions around pay that are based not in a hard objective data analysis of current pay, but sort of part of some program that's not rooted in that, where we say, okay, we're just going to make sort of an across the board change to pay. We're going to, we think, for example, women in our company have been paid historically less, so we're just going to allocate more across the board to increase the pay of women. If that's not rooted in a validated pay equity study, that will certainly be problematic. We've been working with a lot of clients to just basically make sure that your existing DE&I efforts and your pay equity and transparency efforts have a strong compliance foundation. And if it does, I think we'll be good.
All right, thanks so much. So, Maxfield, any thoughts you'd like to add on that topic?
Well, and I also just want to make it clear for people listening that, as we talk about, and again, I won't use DE&I in a negative way here, but as we talk about that, it's not actually just, as a reminder, it's not just at the federal level that we might see policy rollbacks and deregulation. We're already seeing it at a state level to a certain degree, right? Especially within a lot of red states. There's been a lot of legislation proposed and passed in the last 2 years in particular, directly targeting DE&I programs, whether it's state agencies or within universities that are funded by the states. So a lot of employers, looking at that really do need, just to piggyback on what Andrew said, like objective understanding of what equity is. And I would argue that in some ways, it's actually more important now in as there's pushback on DE&I stuff to really get the pay equity piece right, because of these new claims of reverse discrimination and things like that, because it really does give you the ability to fight back on any of those claims in a real concerted, clear manner.
Great. Yeah, no, I completely agree. So continuing with you, Maxfield, how would you expect states to react to a reduction in federal pay equity and pay transparency initiatives?
I mean, that's interesting because, I think, as Andrew rightly pointed out, like this emphasis that the new administration is going to have on, and it's not even just targeting D&I, but essentially targeting all federal agencies to shrink them, if you will, right? So I don't anticipate, for example, federal contractors to stop having to go through compliance audits related to their pay, but the number of them that have to go through it on an annual basis is probably going to shrink significantly under this administration if it's able to do what it wants to do. We have to remember the most recent directive associated with kind of pay data compliance at that federal contractor level actually came out during the first Trump administration. So I don't think the OFCCP is going to get rid of any of this stuff. But again, I do think there's going to be a shrinking of the amount of enforcement that happens around a lot of these things. And I wouldn't be surprised if, in the context of this shrinking, certain states, particularly states that on our heat map already have very high levels, California, Illinois, some of these states might pick up on some of that shrinking at a federal level and institute state level compliance requirements. Many are already doing that, in part because there has been an overall kind of inactivity at the federal level. It's kind of been status quo at the federal level for many years as far as the areas where there actually is pay data enforcement. But I think there's likely to be a state legislative reactionary response to any reports coming out showing a reduced level of compliance or enforcement of any of these kind of federal things that we do have in place, like federal contractor pay data compliance.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just to add to that, what I've observed is that really over the last 20 years, there's been very little action on pay equity and pay transparency at the federal level. The last notable piece of pay equity legislation was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and that was way back in 2009 during the first Obama administration. And for those of you who are familiar with it, the Paycheck Fairness Act. And the Paycheck Fairness Act would update and strengthen the Equal Pay Act. And, I was investigating this a bit, and I did not realize that it was first introduced in 1997 under President Clinton. And at that time, it died in committee in both the House and the Senate. And since then, it's been reintroduced more than a dozen times. And whether a Democrat was in the White House or a Republican, it has not passed. So, we've observed just over the last, decade or so that states have been far more proactive on pay equity and pay transparency than the federal government for many years now. And I assume that's at least in part due to inaction, at the federal level. And just to kind of set that context, remember, it was way back in 2015, that's almost 10 years ago now, where California significantly strengthened its equal pay laws. And as of now, more than 40 states have implemented updates to their equal pay laws to broaden protections against pay discrimination. Then we saw in 2016, Massachusetts instituted a salary history ban. Since then, more than 20 states and at least as many local jurisdictions have passed salary history bans as well. And then, of course, as we're all aware, over the last 5 years, more than a dozen states have passed pay transparency laws. So this is my long way of saying that states have been stepping in for years now to advance pay equity and pay transparency. And I expect that states that have been doing that will continue to do that under, the second Trump administration. So now I want to turn to the topic of enforcement and compliance. So Andrew, what enforcement trends can employers expect at the federal level regarding pay equity?
Yeah, well, I think, one issue that is going to be a reality, and Maxfield alluded to it already, is there is going to be this big focus on reducing the size of agencies. So with any potential reduction in the size of either the Department of Labor or the EEOC, I think they're going to need to be a lot more strategic about what they're doing. And that's not unusual. Typically, the EEOC will announce sort of strategic initiatives. A number of years ago, they announced a focus on failure to hire claims. And after 9/11, they announced a focus on discrimination on the basis of national origin. So they tend to have at least one enforcement priority that's sort of contemporary to the concerns of the particular administration. So we've already touched on this, the issue of potential, for reverse discrimination claims, and I say so-called reverse discrimination claims because there really is no such thing. It's either discrimination or it's not discrimination. But I think that is a possible area where we could see some effort by the EEOC where they announce as a sort of a strategic initiative that they're going to be ensuring that, for example, on the pay equity front, one of the challenges you'll sometimes confront is you'll do a study and you'll find that there are areas where women are disadvantaged with the company, and there are areas where perhaps even men come out lower. What common areas, administrative roles. Now, if coming out of an audit like that, you only made adjustments to one select group, you say, we're going to make adjustments for women, but not for men. In other words, you're not applying sort of a consistent pay philosophy. I do think that is an area of risk with a new Trump administration EEOC. And so I would not be surprised to see in the course of the next year some sort of announcement about what the EEOC intends to do and how they intend to sort of analyze pay equity initiatives or larger sort of DE&I efforts. Beyond that, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more action at the state level. I think claims and litigation is more likely to be the manner of enforcement as opposed to at the administrative level. And I think there likely will be more of a shift towards fueling litigation, whether it's sort of the California approach under PAGA or something like that, where the states say, well, the federal government doesn't really have the bandwidth to enforce this. We don't, for budget reasons, have the ability to do that. So we're going to sort of privatize the ability to make these claims. Of course, these claims can already be brought in class action form, but I think that, that is probably the greatest risk just over the next few years. It's likely to be in the courts more than with the agencies.
All right. And any thoughts, Maxfield?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Andy there. I think, and I think I might have already mentioned this, but I'll just reemphasize it. I do think that we're going to see a shrinking overall of EEOC's ability to engage in enforcement actions. And then also, I do agree with Andy as well that there is likely to be a shift in emphasis. It will be interesting to see how big of a shift that is, Andy, right? Whether or not, does the Trump administration really try to target some of these, as you say, quote unquote, reverse discrimination claims and highlight them in a bigger way, particularly in targeting, say, maybe big universities, particularly in Democratic states that have traditionally had very robust DE&I programs associated with them. But I do think that we are going to see a lot more activity at the state level as well. I also think that there's going to be, and this kind of jumps into your next question here, Gail, regarding federal contractors and compliance audits, and are there going to be any changes there? I don't think that there's necessarily going to be rule changes regarding what federal contractors have to comply with, but I do think that we're going to see a shrinking of the enforcement capabilities within those agencies. And so there's just going to be, I think the overall audits themselves might end up being less robust, and fewer federal contractors are likely to have to go through them.
Yeah, so Andrew, do you have any thoughts on whether you think there could be changes to compliance audits for federal contractors regarding pay equity?
Yeah, I agree. And to be candid, I think federal agencies right now are sort of understaffed. And, for example, at the EEOC, they have sort of internal case handling guidelines. Cases are supposed to be moved forward with reasonable diligence, and the agency sort of imagines that no case will sit around for more than a year, certainly, or but what we're actually seeing is charges of discrimination get filed. We submit position statements and responses on behalf of clients, and frankly, we never hear back. That's become the norm, and that's the current state. The next state, if you take more people out of that system, I think I think overall enforcement activity is going to drop significantly. I also think that the changes that are possibly envisioned with some of that staffing reduction could actually result in changes in the law. I don't think that'll be an immediate thing, but I could actually envision, depending on how deep they actually go with these agency cuts, and the need to put things back in front of Congress to say we want to eliminate, if not the agency, we want to reduce its scope. That's going to require legislative changes. One of the legislative changes, if the scope or staffing of the EEOC is significantly reduced, may revolve around the necessity of filing a charge of discrimination or waiting for a determination by that agency before being able to go to federal court. So in other words, it's not inconceivable that actually some of these changes could result in a faster path to the courts. That's actually something that happened. The states could do as well. Illinois actually did that a number of years ago. I could see other states doing it as well, where they say you have access to our state courts immediately, and it sort of as a reaction to a reduction in staffing. So that's certainly something. As far as federal contractor audits, I certainly think there's going to be a reduced focus on audit activity, and to the extent there is audit activity, it likely will delve into sort of the backlash category more than I think the pay transparency category. And I don't want to call out any attendees here, but there are certain industries and companies that are likely higher risk. Maxfield already touched on big universities. I would say big healthcare institutions. I would also say big tech. And I would say large government contractors like in aerospace and defense.
Great, thank you so much. So, with that as kind of the backdrop, Andrew, how might federal agencies such as the EEOC adjust their focus?
Yeah, so they sort of have their base mission, which is processing charges, and they have already the discretion to decide, when they're going to litigate on behalf of a complainant or take an action on their own. I think they will, by necessity, be very targeted, and when they decide that they want to litigate against an employer on behalf of a claimant or group of claimants, I do think that it is likely to be in the nature of sort of not just making sure that you're generally compliant with the Equal Pay Act, but more targeted towards companies with higher profile DEI initiatives. And then the pay equity piece would be sort of a collateral attack that comes out of that. Candidly, I've not seen extensive pay equity auditing already. Again, this gets us to the current state. It's not something I see a lot of now at the federal agency. So I think that'll be reduced. One additional thing I'll just mention, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about it. We've talked about how this change will likely result in increased activity at the state level. Sort of in parallel with this, though, we also have what's happening in Europe with the EU pay transparency directive. And because a lot of large companies are having to look forward to that compliance effort, and the fact that it's very difficult to have two different pay systems, and it's generally not super desirable to have two different job architecture, to pay people differently, in Europe versus in the States. It's likely that a lot of the sort of drive already is going to continue because of that global compliance concern. So what I think will be interesting is, to the extent any of the member states in Europe come out with something that the Trump administration is not happy with, that they don't agree with the methodology, that could get real interesting. So it's just something to really, as we're looking forward to compliance in Europe, just keep in mind that to the extent any of the member states take an approach that is going to run afoul of the new administration, you're going to have a delicate balance, and a decision to make, which is, do we have two different approaches to comp, one in the U.S. and one sort of in the rest of the world, or can we harmonize the two things?
Yeah, no, I think that's going to be, and I think we'll have some time to talk a little bit more about that. One thing I did in preparation for this, because I really didn't know too much about the makeup of the EEOC. I was just kind of looking into it. And one thing I didn't quite realize is that, at least at the start of President Trump's new term, we'll still likely see, in terms of the mix of commissioners, EEOC commissioners, we'll likely see, at least at the start of his term, that there'll be more Democrats than Republicans as commissioners, because they have, I think, 5-year, that's the length of their term. And so I don't think the mix is going to tilt toward Republicans until sometime in 2026. So at least for the first, 18 months or so of his presidency, the new administration really may not have the ability to push its agenda as much as it would like. I would imagine at the beginning of his term, he's going to appoint a new EEOC general counsel. And so we could see more immediate changes in terms of the cases that are considered for litigation, I think, as you mentioned earlier. But in the short term, at least, since Democrats will still outnumber Republicans in terms of the commissioners on the EEOC, they may still have the ability to block a specific case, from litigation. So given kind of this power balance, I would think that, at least in the short term, the EEOC will probably focus on litigating cases where you get agreement from both Democrats and Republicans that this is a case that should proceed. Now, once the power shifts towards Republicans, then we might start to see the EEOC focus on investigating DEI programs that, like you were mentioning earlier, that allegedly discriminate against, for example, white males. And then, if we look back at President Trump's first administration as any, indicator, we saw a lot less litigation, than during his first term. So I kind of assume we're going to see something similar here, and maybe just a more general business-friendly approach to enforcement. And I think in particular, we can see reduced enforcement activities associated with discrimination claims on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And then lastly, in terms of like the number of charges filed, by individuals, I was looking and I noticed that there was a really dramatic drop in the number of charges filed during Trump's first administration. And I'm sure somebody's done an analysis of this to try and figure out the reasons, but I do think that some of it is based on employees perhaps feeling less empowered. And if they felt less empowered to bring charges to the EEOC during the first administration, I would imagine they probably feel even less empowered during the second administration. So I guess I might expect to see fewer employees actually pursuing claims through the EEOC than we've seen, in the recent past. So moving on to our next topic, wanted to talk a little bit about employer strategies. So starting with you, Andrew, should employers anticipate reduced federal oversight in pay equity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the repeating theme here, right? Yeah, I certainly expect less federal oversight. And I wanted to pick up, because this sort of relates to it, on what you just said, which is a really good observation about the drop in charges. One of the ways that an agency can impact the number of charges in a very direct way, and it's something that we actually see repeatedly. So there's a level of sort of public, I would say, what's the best way of saying this, sort of public sort of, or consumer service. So when you call the EEOC and you say, hey, here's what's going on, I mean, in my workplace, one approach is the EEOC could say, okay, well, if you're unhappy, here's our charge form, fill it out and send it to us. All right, now you've got a charge once you do all that work. Maybe they say you should talk to a lawyer. What we tend to see in Democratic administrations or when the EEOC is sort of better funded, is more customer service. And so instead of just saying, hey, here's the form, fill it out, get back to us, if you even get a human on the phone, which oftentimes is almost impossible, you'll actually get an investigator who will say, that sounds like something that would support a charge. Let me sit down with you, or let's talk through on the call, and I'll actually fill out the charge form for you. And so one of the reasons that I think you see that significant fluctuation in charge activity is because of sort of that customer support approach. I think, when we're thinking about will we see reduced federal oversight, I think we're going to see sort of a reduced customer support kind of focus at the EEOC, both out of budget necessity or policy. I think it's an agency that's already struggling from a budget standpoint. It certainly will struggle from a staffing and budget standpoint, likely even more so in coming years. So I think that's an area where you're going to see the biggest reduction. I do think you're going to see perhaps an even bigger drop in charges than we saw in 2016.
Interesting. All right. Well, we'll have to wait and see if that plays out. And so I agree that, that employers really should anticipate, reduced federal oversight in pay equity. But I guess I want to remind, our audience that just in general, there's been a broader cultural shift toward pay transparency. And, employee behaviors and expectations have pretty dramatically changed. So regardless of what's going on at the federal level in terms of, enforcement, I think employers should expect that their employees will be sharing information about their compensation with their colleagues, their friends, and their family. And if employers aren't sharing information with employees, about their pay philosophy, how their pay ranges are created, how pay within the range is determined, employers are going to work with the resources they have available to figure this out on their own. So I think what this means is that, the possibility of reduced federal oversight doesn't really mean that employers can afford to take their eye off the ball when it comes to pay equity and pay transparency, because there's still going to be plenty of scrutiny by states and by employees. And I think this raises, the next question quite naturally is, well, how can organizations stay proactive in addressing pay disparities in a potentially relaxed regulatory environment? And I think, Andrew and Maxfield, you spoke to this earlier, about, the importance of ensuring pay equity, particularly from a compliance point of view. So regardless of the regulatory environment, ensuring employees are paid fairly should, remain a priority for every organization. So first and foremost, organizations need to make sure they're conducting pay equity reviews on a regular basis and remediating, inequities that are found. And again, as Andrew was saying earlier, these are disparities based on, complex statistical analyses, right? These aren't based on a qualitative analysis. This is a deep quantitative analysis to determine if there are pay inequities, and if there are, ensure those are being addressed. And I think another important way to stay proactive, in a environment of, relaxed regulatory environment, I think it's also important to help prevent pay inequities. It's obviously we can run a pay equity analysis, we can identify disparities and we can address them, but wouldn't it be great to just not have them in the first place, right? So, every compensation decision that's being made, whether it's a new hire pay decision, a merit adjustment, a promotion decision, is an opportunity to prevent, or potentially worsen a pay inequity. So it's really important to provide those that are making decisions around compensation, mostly managers, with the information that they need to make decisions that are in alignment with internal equity. So I think, for organizations, what they can do is they can take steps to embed pay equity into their ongoing compensation management processes. And doing so will help ensure that their pay equity efforts are sustainable and resilient to changes in the external political environment. I know I've talked for a long time, so I'll stop. And Maxfield, I don't know if you have any any thoughts after my very long
No, that was all
diatribe.
really good, Gail. I agree 100%. I think, we kind of threw this language in this question, but one of the things that I think people, even as we're talking about a potential federal de-emphasis, if you will, not that there was a federal emphasis to begin with, but a lessening of this. It's a reminder to everyone that really the activity in this area from a regulatory environment has been at the state level. It's been driven by the states. And as we've already talked about, so many states in the last decade have implemented pay transparency measures at either a state or a city level. And there's now a kind of a mesh web, if you will, across the country of these pay transparency laws. And as well, as you pointed out, Gail, there's a kind of a cultural change in U.S. employees where it's the taboo around sharing your compensation with your coworkers is disappearing to a certain degree, especially among younger generations. And so those two combinations of factors means that your employees are just that much more likely to know about their coworkers' pay, know about the pay ranges that you're being offered. And, I still remember the articles that came out after Colorado implemented their pay transparency law, where people were talking about the fact that they would see a job being posted, their own job for their company, that the pay range is higher than what they're getting paid, right? The whole range. And that kind of backlash on employers where it was like, well, you're not compensating your current employee in the range that you're about to hire somebody new, to that position. And so I think that it's really important for organizations to stay proactive in this space, because there's just that much more risk of if you don't pay attention here, one, creating a pay gap, a pay disparity that runs afoul of your state's equal pay laws. As they're expanding the scope of these equal pay laws, remember, it's not just based upon sex or gender anymore, right? A lot of states, their expansion in this space is to include more and more protected classes, right, from an equal pay perspective. And then you talk about the fact that in some places, there's going to be this new emphasis that they're talking about on things like intersectionality between classes, right? So there's just that much more risk for employers with this information out there, right? If you're not proactive, right, you could end up in a position where, unbeknownst to you, where you are running afoul of your pay equity laws in your state, and your employee figures it out, and now you have a lawsuit at a state level. Whereas if you had simply dealt with the compliance risk up front and managed it, you might not have an issue.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And so, with that in mind, I guess the question comes up, what are some of the potential workforce implications if federal attention to pay equity and pay transparency diminishes? And in my view, if employees believe that there will be less regulatory pressure to ensure fair pay, and that if they suspect that employers in turn will focus less on pay equity and pay transparency, I think this could lead to some, erosion of trust and reduced workforce morale. So it's not like you were saying, Maxfield, it's not just about making sure we're no longer in a world where that's the only thing that matters. So I think employees will be looking to their employers for reassurance that things like pay equity and pay transparency will still be priorities, regardless of what's going on in the political environment. And without this reassurance, employees, particularly those from underrepresented groups, maybe they'll consider leaving for organizations with a stronger commitment to pay equity. Employers may also have hiring challenges, as you mentioned earlier, Maxfield, particularly among younger workers who are more apt to prioritize things like workplace equity and fairness. And I actually be curious what you guys think about this, but I was thinking about it, and I'm wondering if maybe there could be increased unionization efforts. as like a way for employees to address at least the perception of diminished protections from the federal government. I mean, I don't know if we'll see that, but you know, I'm kind of curious if you guys, what you think about that. And then for employees who feel they're being discriminated against, rather than turning to the EEOC, like you guys were saying earlier, maybe they'll go to the state or a local civil rights department to file a claim rather than going to the EEOC. They still have avenues that they can, you know, take to pursue, you know, issues. But I am kind of curious about this unionization, if there's any credence to that, at least as it popped into my mind.
Unionization it's an interesting question, Gail. It's always interesting to me because I feel like, at least at a national level, we keep on seeing like what we think is a big win for unions that might turn into a trend. And then the next thing that happens is a big loss, right? You're seeing it in a lot of like auto manufacturing space, where all of a sudden a manufacturing facility will unionize, and then the next attempt at unionizing the facility fails. And so I'd have a hard time predicting here whether or not this is going to lead to that kind of a trend. I also don't know, especially in the younger generations, right? You know, you're talking about Gen Z here, where their experience with unions, as far as you can tell, is also a lot less than in prior generations, right? So do they really think of unions in the same way that prior generations did, as that kind of protective or potentially protected body? I don't know. It would be interesting to see. Hopefully, we do see some activity there that gives us a insight in either direction.
Yeah.
So we deal a fair amount with clients that are either unionized and they want to maintain workforce harmony, or that are not unionized and want to avoid unionization because they feel like they're functioning well enough as is. And so it is something that we've been watching. There's a number of studies out. The positive view of unions has substantially increased among younger workers over the last several years and is probably at an all-time high. So that sort of, I think, even if you went back, so right after 2008, when a lot of large automakers went bankrupt and some other things happened, union support kind of bottomed out at that point. And so that you were more likely than not to win a union election if you were an employer post 2008. That is now flipped. And so an employer has to basically be able to show sort of the value proposition of not being unionized. And so they have to be extremely proactive in the current environment, where generally workers are less and less sort of suspicious of unions. They're less likely to have been a part of, you know, one of those bankruptcies post 2008. And so that's one reality. The other thing that we're seeing that's relevant not just to the union question, but also the pay equity question. Maybe some of you have played around with this. You can go on ChatGPT and you can say, here's my job description. I'm in this, here's the size of my employer. Here's the town I'm in. How much should I make? And it'll spit out a whole bunch of things. Some of them will be made up. Some of them will be real. You can ask it, give me salary studies. You can say, how much should I make at this particular company? And for those of you who haven't tried this, you should even experiment with your own company. How much does somebody at this company make in this position? And just see how accurate it is. Whether it's accurate or not, it will be perceived as a relevant data point to your employees. And that's actually something we're starting to see quite a bit of. So I bring this up because unions and federal enforcement and a lot of things that I think traditionally have been sort of the path to dealing with these issues, it's not that they're becoming irrelevant, but certainly the landscape has changed. And so even on the union front now, I wouldn't say unions have been replaced, but there are chat boards where a lot of the discussions are happening, and you can see them for your company. Just go on, and there's a whole bunch of them, not just Glassdoor. There's some that are a lot more aggressive than that, and you'll see people talking in real time about how much they're making, how much they think they're getting paid or should get paid, and so all that data is just out there, real or imagined, And so when we're thinking about, what does the world look like with reduced federal oversight, I think one of the things is just keep an eye on that reality. And so then what does that mean for an employer? I think the biggest thing for an employer going into 2025, given all of the stuff that's happening, is the ability to explain pay is going to be extremely important. Like, not just if somebody comes to you and says, how come I make less than so-and-so? The explainability factor should be everybody gets their check. They should understand I'm paid this much because I'm in this band and I've got this year. They really should have, every employee should have an inherent understanding of their pay. Because otherwise they're going to go out and they're going to find other explanations, and they may be crazy. They may be AI sort of hallucinations. They may be very aggressive union organizing efforts that may or may not be completely factual. So that explainability thing is, it falls, I think, more heavily on the employer now with these kind of almost a breakdown in these other things.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, if employers aren't proactive about it, they're not going to be able to control the narrative, right? It's completely out of their hands, right? Like you said, it's some phantom, AI telling us, even though they know that that's not accurate, so we would definitely encourage employers to be more proactive about sharing the rationale for their pay decisions and what the pay ranges are and so people, instead of having to go to these maybe less reputable outside sources, they hear it directly from their employer, which I think ultimately can help to build trust. So I do want to move to our last topic, which is, just broader trends and global context. So Maxfield, how do you expect the U.S. pay equity and transparency efforts to compare with global trends? I know we touched on this, but here we can talk about it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I think Andy, mentioned the EU directive earlier on in our presentation, and I really see that directive as the driving kind of legislative piece globally of what we're going to see changing. It'll be interesting to me to see, as it actually gets fully implemented across the EU member states, how homogenous is it going to be implemented? Like, i.e., are member states going to start copying each other with their implementation once some of the bigger EU member states actually propose legislative implementation of this? Or are we going to see a lot of differences? I'm not sure how we're going to see that because, a lot of member states already have existing equal pay or pay data reporting laws. How much do they want to give up on those old schemes as they implement the EU directive? How much do they layer the EU directive on top of their existing laws? And then I anticipate once we see that implemented, as Andy put it, like, you don't necessarily want two different job architectures, especially if you're a big multinational employer, right? Do we see some pressure then back on US states where we've seen a lot of the activity to start mirroring some of what is happening in Europe? And not just pressure from companies, but legislators looking at what's happening in Europe and going, oh, I want that too for my state, right? California, does it look at the implementation of the EU directive and go, well, our pay data reporting law seems Peasley now. Let's implement what they're doing. Do we change we have a very different pay equity standard across all of our states than is in the EU pay transparency directive. Do we even start seeing something like that creep into US state laws where just the standard itself gets changed, even if they're not implementing the pay data reporting requirements?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think that progressive states are likely to kind of keep their foot on the pedal regarding pay equity and pay transparency. And, not surprisingly, we're going to see less progressive states taking, really any meaningful steps, toward pay equity and pay transparency. And I think this was touched on already, but I just want to reiterate it that, this is particularly tricky for multinational companies, right? So we were talking about different job architectures, but I think it's also just different employee experiences. So, companies that operate globally really need to think about how they manage a global workforce where, pay transparency requirements might be very different in one, area, one region than they are in another. And therefore that might influence what their employees or their job applicants are going to be experiencing, right? So how are companies going to justify kind of differential treatment of employees across geographies? And are they going to want to create a more consistent employee experience rather than kind of a disjointed one that's simply based on trying to be in compliance with all of the different, pay equity and pay transparency requirements globally, or do they take a more global approach? And I do think that forward-thinking organizations in the U.S. might, choose to distinguish themselves by being more proactive about adopting these global practices. So we'll see if that actually, plays out. And, I think that, a question that I think people are really thinking about is, could the new presidency really influence private sector initiatives around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I do think that there could be some influence from the Trump administration on, DEI in the private sector. But I think there are other factors at play, right? So there's action at the state level. And as I mentioned earlier, a general kind of cultural shift towards workplace equity. And in my view, I think organizations are going to continue to focus on DEI if they think it's in their organization's interest in terms of attracting and retaining talent, maintaining employee engagement and morale, and just more generally building trust with employees. For organizations where DEI over the last, let's say, 5 years was more performative than it was substantive, I think we can expect to see a rolling back of DEI initiatives, and we've certainly already seen that. And maybe I'm skeptical, but I think for the companies that are kind of rolling it back, I think the focus was probably not on systemic change in the first place. A lot of it was probably optics and more symbolic gestures. And so it wouldn't surprise me if companies that were focusing on DEI for the optics are going to roll it back when there's pressure, to do so. And I think, I don't know, Andrew, if you have any additional thoughts on kind of how the private sector might respond in terms of just general DEI initiatives.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. The EEOC, after the recent Supreme Court case on affirmative action in higher education, made a really clear statement about how basically it's, that's higher education and not necessarily applicable, but sort of clarifying that it has always been legal to review your workplace practices and make sure that they're not having disparate impacts against different groups. And I think that is something everybody ultimately probably would agree with, whether it's the new incoming Trump administration or the outgoing Biden administration. And so my own, and really what we've been working on a lot in the last year is, I think there was a lot of activity on the DE&I front with a lot of companies, but a lot of it was just sort of activity. It wasn't necessarily rooted in sort of a, comprehensive data-driven strategy. A lot of it was about, whether you could say it was performative or legitimately, trying to, it was more focused on subjectively how people feel about the work experience, which I get that that's important too. But it wasn't terribly data-driven. And frankly, a lot of the data-driven skills that you need to really, I think, do DE&I correctly and in a way that, frankly, no one can argue with it, it does take some technical competence and some tools and support. And I think a lot of programs were launched without necessarily that strong foundation. And so I think any program that doesn't have that strong foundation, whether it gets rolled back or whether it gets sort of less loud publicly while an effort is made to make sure that it is actually rooted in hard, cold data. And so we've done a fair amount of audit work in that area over the last year. And it's funny how often you will go in, you'll look at a program and it'll have a number of goals, but none of the goals were established through any sort of data analysis. They were sort of, this is our perception of the workforce, or this is what we've heard. And when you actually look at the data, you realize, okay, not only did you sort of miss the actual areas where improvement is needed, the goals you set are actually counterproductive. They've actually been undermining progress in certain areas. So maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think there's an opportunity, not for these things to get rolled back, but to maybe get beefed up in a way that nobody can argue with, in a way that's indisputable. And I do think that's actually quite possible. It does take, unfortunately for people that don't like math, it does take math.
Sure. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that everybody can get behind creating unbiased processes that really benefit all employees. Like everybody benefits from unbiased pay processes, hiring processes, promotion processes. Everybody benefits. And so if you're, kind of rooting out that bias and those inequities, everybody wins, really. And I know we only have 1 minute left, and we did get a question, so I want to see if we can address it. It says, speaking of the job posting with higher wage than current employees, do you have thoughts or advice on wage compression and the best way forward? Oh, that's a tricky one. Well, I mean, from a compensation management perspective, I think that it behooves organizations to try and prevent pay compression to the extent possible. So as you adjust your pay, salary structures over time, make sure people are within the range for their role. I mean, I think that's, because at some point, if you fail to do that on a regular basis and set aside budget to address those, compression issues, then you're going to suddenly find yourself in a situation where you have a really big outlay, a really big expense to do that when you're now posting the pay ranges and you have to figure out, well, what do we do about the people that are below the minimum of the range? Well, over time, you want to get them into the range, and you also might want to adjust the ranges that you share in your job postings, right? Because if somebody is legitimately being paid below the minimum of the range, then that's a viable pay rate for a new hire as well. So there are ways to handle that. I don't know, Maxfield or Andy, if you have thoughts.
I mean, I think the emphasis here for me would be on that being proactive, right? I mean, doing pay equity audits, as well as doing analysis on the upfront right before you even post a job, of looking at your internal ranges, looking at market ranges, and really making sure you have a data-driven approach to figuring out what your bands actually should be for a particular job and for the levels within that job is just incredibly important. And one of the things you're looking at when you're doing that is, am I creating a wage compression issue, right? And that's the best way to address it, because if you wait until after you've done it, like as you said, like you could be in a position where now you've created the problem and it's really expensive to fix.
Yeah.
I would say, yeah, I kind of smiled when I saw that, because that issue is probably one of the biggest drivers we've seen in the last year or two for union organizing efforts. And the wage compression thing usually happens in one of two ways. Frontline worker pay had to go up substantially because of shortages of workers in that area and with inflation. And so to get people into frontline roles, starting pay got raised, often higher than existing workers, then triggering all sorts of resentment. And it wasn't even enough if you sort of made it so the new people weren't making more, everyone was just making the same, because then long-term employees were saying, I've been here for 10 years and I make the same as the new guy. So there was that. And the other thing is the increases in the under the Fair Labor Standards Act to be an exempt employee. That's created a tremendous amount of compression now at those other levels. And that brings with it some significant risks as well. And so, yeah, I agree with what you're both saying. You do need longer term planning, because often what happens is people will just budget for what do we need to get above the threshold for the Fair Labor Standards Act, or what do we need to be able to fill these roles. And if you don't do the number crunching to see, you got to reduce that pressure from compression. You do run a high risk of union organizing efforts, employee turnover, and all of that fun stuff. The other thing is, it has, at least one of the things I've seen, it has prompted discussions about, do we have too much, is our job architecture too convoluted? And maybe we need, to take a look at our job architecture to question, is it really wage compression or not?
Yeah, no, it's all good points. All right, well, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. And everybody have a great day.